9 days earlier, their new colonel had ordered a hand-lettered sign hung on a soldier's back. Words no man in the 65th Infantry Regiment would forget. "I am a coward." Now, in the black cold before dawn on October 28, 1952, on a Korean ridge called Hill 391, the men of Fox Company were ordered back up ground they had already bled for twice. Some of them said no. By the time the trials ended that December, 91 soldiers of the 65th Infantry Regiment stood convicted by General Court-Martial. Desertion, willful disobedience of a lawful order, failure to engage the enemy. 95 men had been tried in 15 separate courtrooms that winter, out of 162 who had been arrested. It remains, to this day, the largest mass court-martial of the entire Korean War. Every one of the 91 convicted was dishonorably discharged, stripped of rank, and sent home in disgrace to Puerto Rico, to towns that had sent them off as heroes only 2 years before. It would take 64 years, almost to the day, before the United States government stood before these men and their families and called what had happened to them by its true name. This is the story of the Borinqueneers of Hill 391. Proud soldiers, a punishing colonel, a language barrier written into official army records as a cause of failure, and a court-martial that history nearly buried. But to understand how 91 men came to stand convicted, we have to go back to where the 65th Infantry Regiment began, long before Korea, long before Hill 391. The 65th Infantry Regiment traced its roots back to 1899, the year after the Spanish-American War, when the United States organized an all-Puerto Rican unit under its own flag. By 1950, it trained out of Camp Tortuguero, near Salinas, Puerto Rico, one of the last segregated regiments left in the United States Army. Its soldiers called themselves the Borinqueneers, a name built from Borinquen, the old Taino word for the island itself. To wear that patch was to represent, all at once, a family, a hometown, and an entire people back home. Sergeant Juan Negron came from the same soil the regiment did. He was in his late 20s, wiry and quiet, the kind of man other soldiers watched in a firefight because he never seemed to hurry. He kept a rosary tucked in his breast pocket, worn smooth from handling, a gift from his mother the week he shipped out. Negron had grown up hearing about Puerto Rican soldiers who served in 2 world wars and came home to segregation instead of parade seats. He enlisted anyway, he told a friend, because someone had to prove the island's worth on paper the Army could not ignore. Lieutenant Juan Guzman was younger, mid-20s, a thin mustache above a serious mouth. One of the few Puerto Rican officers commissioned into a regiment mostly led, above company level, by mainland Americans. He kept a creased photograph of his mother tucked inside the lining of his helmet so that she rode with him into every position his platoon dug. Guzman had studied to be an engineer before the war interrupted him. In Korea, friends later said, he was careful with his men's lives in a way that put him at odds with commanders who wanted ground taken faster than the terrain or the artillery support allowed. Corporal Rivera was barely 21, sturdy cropped dark hair, the kind of soldier who kept a unit's spirits up without ever meaning to. He carried a battered tin cup clipped to his pack, dented on one side from a fall down a hillside near Pusan, and every man in Fox Company knew that cup meant coffee was coming, cold hands or not. Rivera had left behind 2 younger brothers and a job loading sugar cane onto trucks outside Ponce. In letters home, he wrote mostly about food, weather, and the men beside him, and almost nothing about the war itself. On the sides of their trucks, in paint the men touched up themselves, the regiment wore its name, Borinqueneers. Officers used it in briefings, enlisted men used it as a greeting. It came with a ration few other American units carried into the field, rice and beans instead of standard mess, a small piece of home the Army had allowed them to keep. To an outsider, it might have looked like a nickname. To the men of the 65th, painted fresh on the trucks every few weeks, it was closer to a birthright, something they intended to carry all the way through Korea and back home again. The 65th landed at Pusan in September of 1950 and fought its way north within weeks. Over its first year in Korea, the regiment absorbed roughly 1,510 casualties of its own while accounting for an estimated 15,007 enemy soldiers killed and 2,069 taken prisoner, figures the unit kept in its own after-action record. General Douglas MacArthur praised the regiment's performance in the field. For a segregated unit that had spent decades being told what Puerto Rican soldiers could not do, the record read like an answer, written in casualty reports instead of speeches. Since long before Korea, the regiment's crest had carried two Latin words, worn on uniforms and repeated at formation until they stopped sounding like Latin at all: honor et fidelitas, honor and fidelity. By the fall of 1951, with more than 1,500 of their own dead or wounded, the men of the 65th Infantry Regiment had more than earned the right to say those words out loud. Rivera's cup made its rounds most nights. Whoever was closest to the fire got the first pour, and the last man always got the grounds. It was a small ritual, the kind soldiers build out of nothing to survive long nights on a ridge. Negron sometimes traded him a cigarette for a second cup. Guzman, when he came through on rounds, never turned it down either, officer or not. In a war fought in mountains and cold that dropped well below freezing, a hot tin cup passed hand to hand did more for morale than any speech from headquarters ever could. Command of the regiment in Korea belonged for a time to Colonel Juan Cesar Cordero Davila, a Puerto Rican officer the men trusted the way soldiers trust someone who has lived their exact life before leading them into someone else's war. Cordero Davila understood the rice and beans, understood the Spanish jokes traded on watch, understood why a corporal's tin cup mattered more than it should. Under him, the regiment's discipline problems were rare, and its morale, by most accounts, was as strong as any unit in the 8th Army. Not every officer above him understood any of that. Most of the regiment's field-grade officers were mainland Americans, English speakers giving orders over crackling radios and through interpreters, to men who thought and swore and prayed in Spanish. In quiet months, the gap barely mattered. Sergeants translated, everyone muddled through, and the regiment kept winning ground. Nobody knew yet that when the fighting turned hardest, in the fall of 1952, that same gap would be written into an official Army report as one direct cause of everything that followed. At dawn on September 18, 1952, the shelling on Outpost Kelly began without warning, and it did not stop. Chinese guns walked their fire across the ridge for hours, cutting telephone wire, burying bunkers, and forcing men to fight from craters instead of trenches. By midday, waves of Chinese infantry came up through the smoke, and the companies holding Kelly found themselves fighting in pockets, radios dead, flanks gone. Nobody on that hill yet knew how many of their friends would not answer at roll call the next morning. By the time the fighting eased the next day, the regiment counted 73 men missing from Outpost Kelly alone, the worst single-day loss the 65th had suffered in Korea. Officers walked the shattered line, calling them into silence. Some of the missing had been captured. Some had been killed and left where they fell when the position broke. Rivera, pulled back with what remained of his platoon, kept his tin cup clipped to his pack out of habit more than comfort, and found he could not remember when he had last eaten. The regiment was still counting its dead when word came down that Colonel Juan Cesar Cordero Davila was being replaced. In his place arrived Colonel Chester de Gavre, a mainland officer, a West Point graduate, the kind of continental commander the men called by that word without malice, simply as a fact. He came in at the worst possible hour, to a regiment still raw from Kelly, needing steadiness more than anything else. What he offered instead was a very different kind of discipline. De Gavre's first orders reached the companies within days. The nickname Borinqueneers, painted on trucks and shouted across chow lines since before Korea, was banned from official use. The rice and beans that had traveled with the regiment from Puerto Rico, the meal that made a cold ridge feel a little less like someone else's war, was cut from the ration list. Mustaches, worn by half the enlisted men, were ordered shaved off. The colonel's memo stating the men would keep them off until such time as they give proof of their manhood. One soldier, accused of hesitating under fire, was made to stand in front of his company wearing a handmade sign hung around his neck. It read in block letters, "I am a coward." No formal charge, no trial, just a private humiliation ordered from above. The men who watched him stand there never spoke of forgetting it. Within a month, the regiment that had fought its way across 100 miles of Korean ridgeline was operating under a commander it did not trust, missing the food it was used to, and carrying a fresh humiliation nobody had asked for. None of it showed up on a supply manifest or an after-action report. but it traveled with every man up the next hill they were ordered to take, a hill soon to be called Jackson Heights, and it would matter more than anyone in headquarters understood. 7 miles northeast of the battlefield known as White Horse stood a ridge the maps called Hill 391. The men who fought there gave it a name of their own, Jackson Heights, after Captain George Jackson, the officer who commanded G Company on its slopes. It was exposed high ground, bare rock and thin cover, with a rise the men called Camelback Hill sitting 2,800 yards to the northwest, close enough to watch, too far to help quickly if the Chinese came at night. Getting supplies up to Jackson Heights meant a long climb under fire, so ammunition, water, and blankets came up in whatever a man could carry on his back. Nights on the ridge dropped well below freezing, and G Company dug what positions the rock would allow, then waited. There was no way to bring artillery close enough to matter without exposing the road below to Chinese observation. Every man on that hill understood, without needing to be told, that if the position was tested hard, help would be slow. G Company moved into position on October 24, and for a day the ridge stayed quiet enough that men wrote letters home and traded cigarettes across foxholes. Guzman made his rounds that night, as he always did, checking on the youngest privates by name. He kept a photograph of his mother folded inside his helmet liner, soft at the creases from being taken out and put back so many times. By the next afternoon, the quiet on Jackson Heights was gone for good. On October 25th, Chinese guns opened up on the ridge and did not let go. More than 250 rounds landed on Jackson Heights that day alone, artillery and mortar fire walking back and forth across the same few hundred yards of rock. Men pressed flat into whatever cover they had dug, feeling the ground jump under them each time a round landed close. There was no ducking a barrage like that, only enduring it, counting the seconds between impacts, and hoping the count kept going. The next day was worse. More than 260 rounds fell on the same ground, grinding communication wire to pieces and collapsing bunkers the men had spent 2 days reinforcing. Water ran low. The wounded who could not be moved lay where they were hit, tended by whoever could reach them between barrages. By nightfall on October 26th, G Company had held for 2 straight days under fire, heavier than most of them had seen in the entire war, and the Chinese infantry had not even attacked yet. On October 27, the barrage lifted and Chinese infantry came up the slope in force. First Lieutenant John Porterfield of A Company was at his command post when a round landed on it directly, killing him instantly along with the men closest to him. It was the kind of loss that did not announce itself with a fight, just a flash and then silence where a command post had been a moment before. G Company held as long as the position allowed, then began to fall back down the ridge they had bled for 2 days to keep. By the time G Company reached the base of Jackson Heights, the company had suffered 23 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, in barely 3 days on that hill. It was not a rout. It was an orderly withdrawal from a position that had become, after 2 days of shelling and a direct infantry assault, no longer defensible with the men and the artillery support available. That distinction would matter little to the officers back at regimental headquarters, looking at a map with the hill no longer colored their own. The order came down within hours. A company and F Company were to move up and retake the same ground G Company had just been forced to abandon, with little in the way of fresh artillery to support them. Rivera heard the order passed along the line and checked his rifle without a word. Guzman, now leading men into the same barrage that had killed Porterfield 2 days earlier, tucked the photograph of his mother deeper into his helmet liner before he moved his platoon forward. There was little illusion in F Company about what they were being asked to do. The ground ahead had already cost one company dearly, and the artillery that might have made the difference simply was not there in the quantities the plan called for. Men checked ammunition twice, wrote quick notes to tuck into pockets, and said less than usual to each other in the last hour before moving out. Negrin passed his rosary through his fingers once, then put it away and picked up his rifle. F Company moved up Jackson Heights on the morning of October 28, into ground still smoking from 2 days of shelling and littered with the wreckage of the earlier fight. Chinese fire found them almost immediately, and the advance slowed to short rushes between what little cover the slope offered. Captain Willis Cronkite held the company forward as long as the position allowed, watching casualties climb with no clear path to holding the crest against another barrage like the one that had already broken one company. By nightfall, with the position no more secure than it had been that morning, and the cost still rising, Cronkite was ordered to pull F Company back down the hill. It was the second American withdrawal from Jackson Heights in 3 days. The men who came off that ridge carried wounded comrades on their backs and said almost nothing on the way down. Rivera's tin cup, dented further, still hung from his pack, and somewhere behind them on the hill, boots and gear lay scattered where their owners had been carried away. 2 companies had now bled on Jackson Heights without holding it, and the men coming off that ridge were exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly certain that headquarters did not understand what it was ordering them into. One more attempt was already being planned, this one aimed at Company C and whatever soldiers from the 1st Battalion could still be sent forward. Nobody on that hill yet knew that the next order to go back up would be the one some of them refused to follow, and that refusal would change all of their lives. On the morning of October 29, word came down from battalion headquarters that Hill 391 would be taken a 3rd time. Company C would lead, filled out with whatever men from the 1st Battalion could still be gathered on short notice. Many of them pulled straight from foxholes, where they had not slept more than an hour at a stretch in 3 days. The hill above them looked exactly as it had after the first assault and the second. Churned earth, splintered pine, no new artillery promised to soften it before they climbed. Word passed down the line fast, and so did the question nobody wanted to say out loud. What had actually changed since the last 2 companies bled on that slope for nothing? The order reached Company F's survivors and a mixed group from 1st Battalion by midday, and this time the answer was not silence. Dozens of soldiers refused to move, Corporal Rivera's squad among them, telling their sergeants plainly that going back up meant dying for ground the Army could not hold with the artillery it was giving them. It was not panic. Men who had climbed that hill twice already stood their ground on level dirt instead, arguing in Spanish and broken English that a 3rd attempt without adequate covering fire was not an order, it was a sentence. Officers pleaded, then threatened, then went to find someone who could make the decision for them. Weeks earlier, after the regiment lost the name it called itself, Colonel Chester de Gavre's order had gone through every company in writing. It told the men to shave their mustaches until such time as they give proof of their manhood. Some still carried the humiliation of it in their pockets the day they said no to Hill 391. Lieutenant Guzman was ordered to lead his company back up that afternoon, the same photograph of his mother still folded into his helmet liner from the day he first landed in Korea. He did not refuse outright. He hesitated, questioning the order allowed to a runner sent from battalion, asking where the promised artillery support was and receiving no clear answer. The company did not move forward as fast or as far as headquarters wanted, and by evening Guzman's name was already being written into a report that would follow him for the rest of his life, the first officer among the 91 who would eventually stand trial. By the end of the day, Major Davies of the 1st Battalion filed a report that more than 50 soldiers had refused to return to Hill 391. It was a number that traveled up the chain of command fast, past regiment, past division, and it landed on desks far from Korea within days. Nobody on that ridge yet understood what would come next. What had been a battlefield decision, made by exhausted men without enough artillery cover, was about to become a legal case, and the Army was already deciding how it would answer for 2 lost companies and a hill it had never managed to hold. The arrests began within 48 hours. Military police moved through the company areas with lists of names, and men who had fought together for 2 years watched their friends called out one by one and told to gather their gear. There was no dramatic scene, no resistance. Soldiers who had refused an order on a hillside now followed a different order without question, walking to trucks that would take them away from the only unit most of them had ever served in. By the second morning, the company areas felt strangely empty, the way a barracks feels after a rotation home, except nobody was going home. In the end, 162 Puerto Rican soldiers were taken into custody, far more than would ever stand trial. They were held apart from the rest of the regiment in tents and makeshift compounds guarded by military police who were in many cases from their own division. Nobody explained clearly what would happen to them or when. Rumors moved faster than facts. Some men heard they would be sent home in disgrace, others that they would be shot, others that it was all a mistake that would be sorted out within the week. None of the rumors turned out to be entirely true. Interrogations started almost immediately, conducted mostly in English by officers who did not speak Spanish, working through translators who were themselves soldiers pulled from the ranks. Men were asked to explain, in a language many of them used haltingly, exactly why they had not returned to a hill under artillery with no promised support. Answers that made sense in a foxhole sounded thin and confused written down in a stenographer's shorthand. Some soldiers signed statements they only partly understood, trusting that a uniform and a badge meant the process was fair. At night, under guard, the men did what soldiers have always done while they wait. They shared what little they had. A pack of cigarettes passed from hand to hand until it was gone, no one keeping count of who had taken more than his share. Someone hummed a few bars of a song from home, and a few others picked it up quietly, more out of habit than cheer. It was not defiance and it was not despair, just men trying to hold on to something ordinary in the middle of a process none of them had chosen and none of them fully understood. Sergeant Negron, who had held a position alone through the night at Calma Airy the year before and killed 15 enemy soldiers within feet of his own foxhole, stood at the edge of the holding area and watched men he had served beside, for 2 years led away in handcuffs. He had not refused an order on Hill 391. He was not on the list. That did nothing to make the sight easier to watch, comrades he trusted with his life being marched off like men already judged, before a single court had convened to hear a single case. Corporal Rivera still carried his battered tin cup, clipped to a pack that no longer held much else worth keeping. It had gone empty days earlier and stayed that way, since coffee was one more small comfort that had disappeared along with rank, rifle, and unit. He kept it anyway, out of habit more than hope, tapping it once against his boot before sitting down each night in the holding area, the way he had always done before sleep, back when sleep meant something closer to rest. Some men prayed the rosary quietly after dark, beads moving through fingers under blankets too thin for the Korean cold. Negron still carried his own, tucked in his breast pocket since the day he had first shipped out, though he was not among the accused. For the men waiting on trial dates they did not yet know, the prayers were less about asking for anything specific than about marking time, 1 decade of beads at a time, in a place where the days had stopped following any pattern they recognized. Weeks earlier, a soldier from the regiment had been made to wear a handmade sign that read simply, "I am a coward." Now, in the charge sheets being drafted against 95 men, the same accusation reappeared in the Army's own language: willful disobedience, failure to engage the enemy. The words on cardboard and the words in legal ink were starting to sound the same. No word of any of it had reached Puerto Rico yet. Wives, mothers, and sweethearts back in Salinas and Ponce and San Juan still believed their men were simply fighting the war the newspapers ascribed. The one where the regiment killed thousands and took the Army's praise. Letters kept arriving from home describing ordinary things: a new roof, a sister's wedding, a debt finally paid off, addressed to men who could not yet write back anything close to the truth of where they now stood. Judge Advocate General officers arrived from outside the division to build the cases, working through statements, unit records, and the accounts of officers like Guzman and Cronkite who had been present on the Hill. Charge sheets took shape around 3 categories: desertion, willful disobedience of a lawful order, and, for at least one officer, failure to engage the enemy. Of the 162 men originally detained, the Army settled on 95 who would actually face a court, a number that itself would keep changing as trial dates approached. The Army chose to try the men in 15 separate general courts-martial rather than one large proceeding, a decision that would let each panel weigh evidence in smaller, more manageable pieces. Convening orders went out in late November. For the accused, the news landed as one more piece of a process moving without them, decided in rooms they never entered by officers many of them had never met. 95 names were now attached to case numbers, the war around them continuing without pause. By the third week of November, the first of the accused were marched under guard to a converted building serving as a courtroom, boots loud on a wooden floor built for something other than trials. Rivera's cup was gone by then, lost or taken somewhere between formations, and he did not ask after it. What waited inside that room would decide not just whether these men were guilty of anything, but whether the story of Hill 391 would be remembered as an act of survival or an act of shame. The first trial opened at 9 in the morning on November 23rd, in a wooden building requisitioned for the purpose, its windows still marked with tape from an earlier air raid drill. First Lieutenant Juan Guzman sat at the defense table in a pressed uniform, the photograph of his mother still folded into his helmet liner back at the company area. He was the first officer charged, accused of willfully disobeying a lawful order and failing to engage the enemy on Hill 391, and the Army had chosen to try him before any of the enlisted men who had stood beside him that night. Guzman did not raise his voice through 2 days of testimony. Witnesses described the barrage, the missing artillery support, the order to retake ground with men who had not slept in 3 nights. He answered each question the same way he had once answered roll call, short and exact, offering nothing more than what was asked. Observers in the room, including at least one visiting judge advocate officer, later noted his composure as unusual for a man facing the possibility of years at hard labor and a discharge that would follow him home to Puerto Rico for the rest of his life. Across the aisle sat prosecutors building a case on paper that could not fully capture what had happened on the Hill. The 2 days of shelling, the language in which orders had arrived, the officers rotated out just before the fighting began. None of that appeared as a formal defense. Military law asked a narrower question, whether a lawful order had been given and whether it had been obeyed. And by that measure alone, the ledger for many of the accused men did not look favorable, no matter what circumstances had shaped the moment. Defense counsel, assigned quickly and often unfamiliar with the men they represented, worked case by case with limited time to prepare. Some soldiers testified through interpreters, their Spanish translated into English for a court that would decide their futures in a language many of them barely used. Sergeant Negron, called as a witness in one of the Company F trials, answered in short bursts of accented English, his rosary beads visible for a moment against his collar as he shifted in the chair, a small habitual motion nobody in the room commented on. Weeks earlier on Hill 391, a soldier had been made to wear a handmade sign around his neck. Now the same words were read into the trial record as evidence of the command climate the men had served under. "I am a coward," the prosecutor read it once, flatly, before moving to the next exhibit. For the men watching from the gallery, it landed differently. A sentence meant to shame now standing as testimony to what leadership had already decided about them before a single shot was fired that October. Trial followed trial through the first week of December, cases moving with a speed that left little room to absorb what had come before. Company F men who had refused the October 28th order faced panels one after another, their stories overlapping in ways that should have strengthened a shared defense, but instead were heard in isolation, case number by case number. Some panels sat for a single day, a few stretched longer. By December's second week, more than half of the 95 scheduled trials had already returned a verdict. Corporal Rivera's case came in the second week, his file thin compared to the officers who preceded him. He had no defense witnesses beyond 2 men from his own squad, both of whom had also been charged. He told the panel what he remembered of the Hill in December's third week, the artillery, the order, the choice made in the dark with no ammunition resupply promised and no relief in sight. It took the panel less than an hour to reach a verdict. He was found guilty of willful disobedience of a lawful order. The word Borinqueneers did not appear anywhere in the official charge sheets, but it surfaced anyway, in testimony about morale, in questions from defense counsel about what had changed in the weeks before the Hill. One witness mentioned that the men had stopped hearing the name at all after September, that it had simply gone quiet along with the rice and beans and the mustaches, as though erasing a name from daily use might also erase whatever had made these particular soldiers a regiment worth naming in the first place. By December 26th, the 15th and final court-martial closed its proceedings. Of the 95 men who had stood trial that month, 91 were convicted on charges of desertion, willful disobedience, or in Guzman's case, failure to engage the enemy. Sentences ranged from 1 year to 18 years of hard labor, and every convicted man, officer and enlisted alike, received a dishonorable discharge, the single word that would follow each of them onto every job application and every conversation with a Veterans Affairs clerk for years afterward. Guzman's own sentence placed him among the longest terms handed down, a verdict that would later be remembered mainly for what came after it, not for what it said about him in December of 1952. He was led from the courtroom in restraints, past the same tape-marked windows he had walked beneath weeks earlier, his mother's photograph still folded in a helmet liner that no longer belonged to a soldier on active duty. Somewhere in a supply room, his rank insignia and campaign ribbons were already being logged for removal from the record. News of the convictions crossed the Atlantic and the Caribbean slower than the men would have liked, arriving in letters and telegrams weeks after the verdicts themselves. In towns across Puerto Rico, families who had spent 2 years praying over casualty lists now opened envelopes carrying a different kind of grief, words like dishonorable and hard labor sitting beside names their sons and husbands had carried since childhood. Some mothers did not tell their neighbors right away. Others could not keep the news from spreading past their own front doors. American newspapers picked up the story within days, and the coverage did not linger on artillery counts or rotation policies. Headlines used the word cowards, a word none of the men had chosen for themselves and one the regiment had never worn before Hill 391. For a unit that had buried its dead at Kelly only weeks earlier, that had fought since Pusan with casualty numbers few stateside readers ever saw, the label arrived faster than any correction ever could, and it would take decades to loosen its grip on how the story was told. Buried in the same evidence file that damaged so many of the accused sat an order few reporters ever quoted. Colonel de Gavre had directed that the men shave their mustaches until such time as they give proof of their manhood. A judge-advocate reviewer, reading the file months later, underlined the line twice in pencil, a small private mark that would eventually help turn official opinion, long before any headline caught up to it. Not every officer who read the transcripts in early 1953 accepted the verdicts at face value. A handful of judge-advocate reviewers, working through case files far from any camera or headline, began comparing what had happened on Hill 391 to incidents involving mainland units elsewhere in Korea, soldiers who had also refused orders under heavy fire and had never faced a court-martial at all. Nobody wrote that comparison into a press release. It went into internal memoranda instead, quiet paperwork that would take years to matter to anyone outside the Army. By the last days of December, the 91 convicted men were already being processed for transfer. Their service records closed out with the same efficiency that had opened their case files 6 weeks earlier. Rivera packed the few belongings he still had, his cup long gone, his F Company patch already removed from the jacket he would not be allowed to keep. Whatever came next for these men, prison labor, discharge, the long trip home to towns that had once celebrated their enlistment, none of it would be decided by anyone who had stood beside them on that hill. In July of 1953, Secretary of the Army Robert Stevens signed an order granting clemency to 53 of the 91 convicted men. There was no ceremony, no announcement read aloud on any parade ground. Word arrived instead in typed letters mailed to towns across Puerto Rico, sentences quietly reduced, records amended by officials in Washington who had never set foot on Hill 391. For the soldiers still serving out hard labor, the letters meant one thing. Someone above them had finally read the file all the way through. Inside that same file, reviewers kept returning to 5 words scrawled on a handmade sign: "I am a coward." Forced onto one soldier's chest in the fall of 1952, the sign was later entered into the Army's own record as evidence of collective punishment, not discipline. A line meant to humiliate a man became, years afterward, a line used against the officers who had ordered it made. By 1954, every sentence connected to Hill 391 had been remitted. The last name cleared belonged to First Lieutenant Juan Guzman, the very officer who had been the first man court-martialed back in November of 1952. He had waited longest of all 91, his rank offering him no shortcut through the paperwork. When his file finally closed, Guzman was reinstated on record, a quiet ending to a case that had opened with his name sitting at the top of the docket. The reason so few Americans ever heard this story was not secrecy so much as circumstance. The 65th Infantry Regiment spoke Spanish in a service that filed its records in English, and clemency, unlike a courtroom reversal, produced no public hearing, no reporter's notebook, no headline correcting the ones already printed. Files scattered between Puerto Rico, Washington, and Korea were never gathered into one account. The men went home to towns that remembered the word desertion long after the army itself had quietly stopped believing it. 6 decades later, the record caught up with one soldier who never lived to see it. Master Sergeant Juan Negron, who had held a position alone through the night at Calma Airy in 1951, had received the Distinguished Service Cross at the time. On March 18, 2014, President Barack Obama presented his family with the Medal of Honor instead. The citation upgraded after a review that re-examined decades of overlooked valor among Hispanic and Jewish veterans of 2 wars. On April 13, 2016, veterans of the 65th Infantry Regiment gathered on the steps of the United States Capitol to receive the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor, 64 years almost to the day since the first gavel had fallen on their court-martial in the winter of 1952. The medal carried the regiment's old motto, Honor e Fidelitas, honor and fidelity, cast beside a sentry box from old San Juan. For men once forbidden to say their own nickname aloud, someone finally said it for them, from the Capitol steps. Somewhere among the men who lived to see that ceremony, a rosary still sat folded in a breast pocket, and a battered tin cup, or one very much like it, still turned up at reunions filled with black coffee. The word Borinqueneers, banned by an order in the fall of 1952, was spoken freely now, printed on caps and worn without a second thought. Had you heard of the Borinqueneers before today? 91 men once carried the word deserter home to Puerto Rico. It took 64 years and a great deal of quiet paperwork to carry it back the other way. Master Sergeant Negron's family accepted the Medal of Honor on his behalf that spring afternoon, a small blue box for a man who had spent 63 years listed only as a Distinguished Service Cross recipient, one line in a unit history most Americans had never opened. His widow, by then elderly, told reporters afterward that she had waited so long for the phone call that she had stopped expecting it. The upgrade came from the same review that finally looked past the surnames on old paperwork. The review that reached Negron's file did not start with Korea. It began years earlier with a broader Pentagon effort to re-examine Distinguished Service Crosses, awarded to Jewish and Hispanic veterans of World War II and Korea, men whose citations, investigators found, had been quietly capped below the Medal of Honor by boards that never said why. Negron's name surfaced almost by accident, one folder among hundreds pulled for a second look decades after the fact. Colonel Chester de Gavra never faced a court-martial of his own. He left Korea, finished a full army career, and died without ever publicly revising the order that stripped the beans and rice, or the order that banned a nickname. Historians who later studied Jackson Heights did not paint him as a villain in a black hat. They described a tired command structure, short on interpreters, short on artillery shells, short on the officers who had once known these men by name before rotation orders sent them home. For decades, the story lived only in fragments, a mention in a regimental newsletter printed in Spanish and read mostly by men who had already lived it, a paragraph in a court-martial ledger in the National Archives, a rumor passed at a wedding in Ponce about an uncle who came home and never spoke of Korea again. English-language military histories of the war barely mention the 65th at all. A regiment that had fought at the Chosin Reservoir and along the 38th parallel became, in most textbooks, a footnote or nothing. Today, a bronze marker stands near Salinas, Puerto Rico, not far from where the regiment once trained, and a monument bearing the unit's crest sits blocks from the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. School children on the island now learn the word Borinqueneers before they learn the word court-martial. Veterans groups hold reunions every April 13, pouring black coffee into tin cups that have nothing to prove anymore, telling stories that no longer need to be told quietly. No one court-martialed for Jackson Heights ever raised a hand against an American officer. They raised a question about an order given after days without enough artillery to answer the guns across the valley, and for that question, 91 men carried the word deserter home. Had you heard of the Borinqueneers before today? The Congressional Gold Medal cannot give a dead soldier back his years, but it can put a name where a number used to be, and on April 13, 2016, that is exactly what it did.